Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to make a start on the Tamiya Scania 770S. As usual, for the first video in a build, we're going to start slowly for anyone new to Tamiya kits, and then we'll pick up the pace. We will be building with a few upgrades and mods just to mix things up a bit, so if you're after a stock build, there's 2 or 3 other Tamiya builds on the channel. Right, first in the manual, Tamiya let us know what we need to get the truck running. It's the usual radio, transmitter and receiver, ESC, a couple of servos, battery and a charger. Now, I wouldn't follow that as an absolute though. The good thing with these trucks is the sheer amount of aftermarket bits and bobs. You can also go completely custom. There's also some paint. Tamiya paint is great but rather expensive, so I tend to use a good plastic primer and then automotive paint with a lacquer. For tools, we're going to need a couple of JIS drivers. Now Phillips will do in a pinch, but JIS bits are far better since the screws have JIS heads. Some pliers for the E-clips and some sharp side cutters for trimming the parts from the parts trees. A good sharp knife for cleaning bits up. There's some Allen head screws in this kit, and it does come with some basic Allen keys, but I'd highly recommend getting yourself a good set. Of course, other tools will definitely help here and there, but that lot you'll just about get away with. On the next page we have the neat little warning cartoons, always fun. Next we have the beginning of the build. Now Tamiya diagrams are super detailed and clear for the most part. Every so often you might have to think a bit, but it's nothing major. The build is broken up into sections starting with A. Each section has a bag of metal parts, so for this section we use bag A. Each section covers a complete assembly, so this section covers the chassis rails to make up the ladder frame. If we open up the bag, we find some large parts and a set of smaller bags. To make it easy to find the bits when we need them, it's a good idea to empty the bags out into some pots. These are just sponge pudding pots available from every good supermarket, complete with a pudding inside. The big bits can just go off to the side of the bench so they're ready to grab. Right, step 1, setting up and testing the servos. Now for the steering, it's pretty much any standard servo will do. You don't need anything amazingly powerful. Having said that, I'd recommend something around 25 kg/cm with metal gears. And the speed of course isn't really that critical. If anything, a slow servo might be a bit more realistic. Tamiya want us to rig up all the radio gear, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but if you have a servo tester it does make things a bit quicker. This one's my own design, unfortunately not available anymore. Hopefully I'll get to making a Mark II one of these days. Anyway, we just need to plug the servo in and we can give it a quick check. Then we centre it, and with this tester we just press the button and it'll centre lock. Normally we'd go into testing the gearshift servo too, but we're doing something a bit different on this build, so we'll get to that when we're building the gearbox with bag C. Now on to the second part of step 1, servo savers, or servo saver, as of course we're only doing the steering. We need some plastic parts to make up the servo saver. Now each part has a letter and a number on the diagram. So for example, the plastic washer is part E2. That means we need parts tree E, and each parts tree has a tab with the letter on it. And the part number is 2, where the number's next to the part. To cut the part from the tree, we use the side cutters to cut the part as flush as possible. With some parts you might need to smooth the remaining little nub a little bit with a knife, but generally the cutters are good enough. For the steering servo saver, we need the E2 washer, E11 the arm, E1 the spring, and E13 the Futaba splined boss. Next on the left hand side we have a list of the metal parts and fixings. We don't need all the parts since we're only doing the steering servo, but we do need the 5mm ball end, the M3 plain nut, and the M3x10 screw. Now some servos might need a different screw, but generally if you're using a Futaba splined servo, or 25 tooth, the M3x10 or 3x10 self-tapper if you've got plastic gears will do the trick. To assemble, first we need to press the boss onto the servo. With the output spline on the left, the lug on the boss wants to be downwards. Next the spring goes on, we need to open it up so it fits over the lug on the boss. Then the arm with its lug slotted into the spring, washer next, and then the screw to hold it all together. Now as a servo saver goes, the Tamiya one is okay. If you've got a plastic gear servo, it'll protect the servo well enough. The issue is it's a bit soft, and you mind a bump in the road and the truck will veer off in one direction or the other. Now we've got a metal gear servo, so we don't really need the servo saver at all. That makes for a far more solid steering system, and of course helps keep the truck driving nice and straight. So mod number 1, a metal servo arm. It's actually easier to fit than a servo saver, but if nothing else, we've had a look at how the manual works. So to fit the new arm, first we need to remove the servo saver. Then we fit the new arm, which is the clamping type. So to make sure it doesn't fall apart, we need to use a little bit of blue thread lock on the small clamp screws. There's 2 to do, and we only need a tiny amount of thread lock on the screws before we thread them in. Now we can pop the arm on and thread in the M3 screw. For now, it just wants to be done up just enough to take up the slack, but not fully tight. Now we can nip up the clamp screws, and lastly, now it's all nice and snug, we can tighten up the M3 screw. This setup will have the least amount of slop or play in the steering as is possible. The only slop left will be in the servo's gear train. The only issue we might find is the new arm is quite a lot longer than the stock servo saver. We'll probably need to drill a hole closer in to get the right range of motion in the steering. It'll do for now though. We won't know for sure what needs to happen until the front axle has been fitted and we can test out the steering. Right, that just leaves the ball end, which just threads into one of the holes in the arm. We don't need the nut, as the arm already has a hole tapped with an M3 thread, so we just thread it in and nip it up. Step 2, servo mounts, or mount as we're only doing a steering servo. We need 1 3x8 self-tapper, 3 3x10 black washer head self-tappers, Z12 the mounting plate, and 2 C4s the mounting posts. Now it doesn't really matter much what order you assemble the mounts, the trick is not to fully tighten the screws until it's all together. So first we'll attach the post to the servo with 2 of the washer head screws. We want to do them up so the post can still just about move, so when we offer them up to the plate they can find their own position. On the plate there's a square hole for one post where we use the non-washer head screw. The other post fits into a slot so it can be adjusted to fit slightly different sizes of servo. These days they're all pretty much the same, but it's still nice to be able to take out the small differences. Once all the screws are in, we can go around and nip them up. Generally with plastic parts especially, all we need to do is bottom out the screws, then give them an extra little tiny tweak. There's a little bit of feel involved. Just be a bit careful as you really don't want to over tighten them and strip out the plastic. The servo assembly can now go off to the side for a couple of steps so it's ready to fit when we need it. Step 3, the rails, where we're going to need quite a few bits. For the metal parts we need 12 M3x6s, 2 M3x18 step screws, 4 3x12 self-tappers, 3 thin M3 9/0 nuts, 2 3mm washers, 2 flat leaf spring mounts, 2 stepped leaf spring mounts, 2 front damper mounts, 4 shackle plates, 3 side skirt mounts with a horizontal tab, and 1 side skirt mount with a vertical tab. For plastic there's 2 G2 large spacers, 2 G10 thin spacers, 2 G6 leaf mount spacers, 2 C5 leaf mount blocks, and a C15 shift rod guide. Lastly, of course, we do need the chassis rails. Now they've got some plastic on them that needs peeling, but other than that they're ready to go. As always with Tamiya kits, all the holes are very nice and clean and the threads are nicely tapped. One of the issues that can come up with the clone kits is misaligned holes and wonky threads. It's always nice to have everything just fit perfectly first time. Okay, this step is split up into 2 assemblies, a left and a right hand side. There's not much point in doing both on video, so we'll just do the right hand side as it touches on the use of thread lock around the plastic parts. We'll start with the damper mounts. The rails, the screws and the mounts are all metal, so we don't have to worry too much where the thread lock goes. However, we really don't want to use a lot of it to do the job. We can use a cocktail stick to pick up a drop of thread lock and then just spot it inside the threads. It'll transfer just enough without making a huge mess. Then we can offer up the mount and attach 2 of the M3x6s. If there's any excess thread lock, we can then mop it up with a paper towel. At the front we have the leaf spring mount. It uses 2 self-tappers, and we add the stepped mount, the flat mount and the spacer with the 2 holes. Then we pass the screws through the holes in the front of the chassis and screw them into one of the blocks, nipping them up so they're just snug, plus a little extra tweak. Now, because we're threading into plastic, we can't and don't really need to use the thread lock. The plastic should grip the screws just fine. The issue with the thread lock is it will attack the plastic, making it go brittle, which of course isn't good. So what if you want to mount plastic parts to a metal part? Well, the shift rod guide is just one of those situations. We should use the thread lock, but we don't want to get any on the plastic. So what I tend to do is I first fit the part. So here it's fitted to the underside of the rail with 2 of the M3x6s. Then again, using a cocktail stick, we can apply some thread lock to the threads where they stick out the back. Just like the damper mount, we only need a tiny amount. Then we can loosen the screw just far enough we can see the thread lock go down into the threads. Then we retighten and mop up the excess. Which of course does bring up another point. You might have noticed I'm not using the thread locker that comes with the kit. You see, the stuff in the kit is quite a thick gel, almost like a paste. From experience, it still makes the plastic go brittle, but it's really difficult to safely apply around the plastic. Instead, I like to use a liquid thread locker, where you only need to use a tiny amount and it'll find its way into the threads without going absolutely everywhere. Okay, further back along the rail, we need to fit one of the side skirt mounts and a shackle. It's all metal, and the first screw threads directly into the rail, so we need to use some thread lock. Now you can apply the thread lock directly to the screw and fit it, but it's not easy to only apply a small amount. You almost always end up with a bit of a blob. It does work of course, but it can be messy, and of course you do waste a fair bit of thread locker over a kit build. In the long run, it's much easier to use the cocktail stick like we did with the damper mount. In the other hole we need the leaf spring shackle and a step screw. To make up the shackle we use the step screw and we slide on a G10 thin spacer, shackle plate, the G2 thick spacer, another shackle plate followed by a washer. That lot then goes straight through the hole in the skirt mount into the chassis rail, and we use one of the thin nylock nuts to attach it. Now usually we just use the cross wrench from the kit as with most of the other nuts, but these ones are really close to the edge of the rail, so there's not enough space. Tamiya recommend using the spanner that comes with the kit, which is fair enough, but I prefer using parallel jawed pliers. They grab the nut and keep the part stable so it's not wobbling around while we're trying to tighten up the screw. When it's all tight, the shackle plate should spin freely on the step screw. If it's tight, do find out why. Usually one of the plates is being pinched, so loosening and retightening the screw should get them spinning. The last part is to fit the rear side skirt mount, which just fits with the 2 M3x6s that thread directly into the rail, so we need to use some more thread lock. There's no plastic involved, so we can of course be lazy and apply it directly to the screw and mop up the extra. And that's one side built. The other side is just a mirror image, except for the shift rod guide, like so. Now hopefully that covers the use of thread lock fairly well. From here on, we're not going to be going into quite so much detail. As long as you keep in mind thread lock on plastic is bad, you should be fine. Right, step 4, cross members. We need 8 3x8 self-tappers, Z13, the cross member that sits behind a gearbox, Z3, the cylinder that attaches to Z13, which is usually black but I've painted it off camera, C1 and C3 that make up the cross member the rear suspension mounts to, and there's Z7 and 8 plus a C20 that makes up the rear cross member. Okay, first the cross member. The 2 halves come together and we install 4 screws. Nip them up and of course that would be it, except it's quite handy to drill a hole through the part for the wiring. A 5 or 6mm hole does the job. It just makes it so much easier to run the wires to the tail lights and keep the wires out of the axles. Z13 already has some holes, so that's sorted. It does have a right way round though, so check the diagram very carefully. Otherwise it's just 2 screws to attach the cylinder. The rear cross member just has the 2 rail extensions attached with the last 2 screws. With all 3 complete, we can pop them off to the side until we need them. Step 5. Making up the frame. We need 6 M3x6s, 4 3x10 self-tappers, 21 3x8 self-tappers, and 4 rubber bump stops. We need the 2 metal rear suspension mounts, 2 Y1s and 2 Y2s. Now these were white plastic, so I painted them black. Then we have the C2 front cross member, F1 the middle cross member, and 2 Z1 battery holder spacers. Now before we do any building, we're going to need to drill another hole in F1 to match the one we drilled in the cross member. Just make sure when all the parts are on the chassis, the holes do line up. Okay, first we'll fit the bump stops. Now they just mount to the chassis with M3x6s. However, so we can't lose the rubber bits, it's not a bad idea to glue them into the Y parts. Now I'm using an odourless cyanoacrylate, but pretty much any glue will do. Tamiya recommend a rubber cement. When I built the Grand Hauler a few years ago, which does use the same parts, I didn't glue them, and so far they've been fine. But a spot of glue can't hurt, and just make sure they're not going to fall out. There's 2 bump stops to fit per side. Then a bit further forward we can fit the battery holder spacer, again this time with a single M3x6. All 3 screws will need some thread lock, remembering to be careful not to get any on the plastic. The other rail needs the same treatment, 2 bump stops and the spacer. Next, right at the front, we can fit the front cross member with 2 of the 3x8 self-tappers. Now until all the cross members are in and the other rail is attached too, we will keep the screws just a little bit loose. If you tighten them now, you might find the holes don't quite line up when you bring the 2 rails together. Next would be the shift servo, but we're not fitting one just yet. Then we have the cross member with the cylinder. The plain cross member next, and just make sure you get it the right way around so the holes for the wiring all line up. Next is the cross member with the metal plates. The 2 upper screws are the 3x10 self-tappers and the lower one is a 3x8. And last, right at the back, is the cross member with the rail extensions. Now we just need to offer up the other rail and install all the screws. Once they're all in, go round and nip them up. You should be left with a nice square chassis ready to fit all the other gubbins that make it a truck. Okay, step 6, the steering bell crank. We need 2 M2x5s, 2 M3 nuts, a long 5mm ball end, a regular 5mm ball end, an 1150 bushing, an 850 bushing, both of which are going to be replaced with bearings, 6 rod ends, the steering shaft, and then we've got 3 rods, 105mm, 42mm and a 16mm. Then for plastic we have C6 the upper arm, C16 the spacer, C14 the housing and C7 the lower arm. Starting at the top, we can pop the top arm onto one end of the shaft and screw in one of the M2 screws. Ultimately they do need some thread lock, but I'm planning to replace this assembly at some point not too far away, so I'm going to leave it dry. Next we slide on the large bearing followed by the plastic spacer. Then the housing goes on with the large end matching up with the large bearing. At the bottom end we pop in the small bearing and slide on the bottom arm. Now it's critical you get the angle right. The arms should be at 90 degrees to each other. There's a handy diagram so you can't really get it wrong. Lastly, of course, we need to thread in another M2 screw. Now if you're using the stock bushings, you're going to want to use a bit of grease, but with bearings you really don't need any. It's just going to attract dirt and generally make a bit of a mess. Now the only problem with this assembly is quite a minor one. There's a small amount of slop where the shaft can move up and down inside the bearings. It's only very small, but it does add a little bit of wobble to the steering. A pack of assorted 5mm shims can be very handy to take up the slack. Right, next we have the linkages, and right away we can get rid of the long one. We've got something else to go in its place in the next video. And we'll also not be using any of the Tamiya rod ends or the balls. They're notoriously sloppy. Not the end of the world, but it does mean the trucks do struggle a bit to go in a straight line. You constantly have to adjust things, even on a flat surface. So I'm going to replace them with RC four-wheel drive rod ends. They're a fair bit tighter and have essentially no slop. With a couple of other changes, we should end up with a very precise steering setup. For the medium rod, it's just a case of threading them on. However, for the short rod, the rod ends themselves are a bit too long. If we compare them with the Tamiya ends, you can get a feel for just how long they should be. Then it's just a case of using a sharp knife to cut them down. If you have tough fingers, a small hobby knife works, but I would highly recommend using a Stanley knife, as there's a bit more to get hold of while you're pressing down. If you really struggle, you can use a hacksaw, but the ends won't be quite so smooth. The RC four-wheel drive rod ends are pretty tight on an M3 thread, so to help things along I'm going to use a tap just to make a couple of turns of thread. I'm not going all the way in, as we still want the rods to cut their own thread and grip the plastic tightly. Now we fit the rod ends to the rods, setting them up so the hole centres match up with the diagrams. It doesn't matter too much at this stage if they're a little bit off. You almost always need to give them a tweak once everything's fitted, just to square things up whatever you do. Since the RC four-wheel drive rod ends have the balls already fitted to them, we won't be needing the Tamiya ball ends. We will need the nuts though. Step 7. Fitting the steering servo. We need the bits from the last step, except for the short rod, plus we can remove the ball end that we fitted to the servo arm as we've got the RC four-wheel drive rod ends. We'll also need 4 M3x12s and 3 M3x8s. First we'll mount the bell crank with the 4 M3x12s. A bit of thread lock wouldn't hurt, but as mentioned I'm planning on changing the bell crank at some point soon hopefully, so I'm going to leave it dry. A bit further back we can fit the servo. Again, a bit of thread lock would be good, but I'm going to be swapping the mount for a metal one when it arrives, so I'm leaving it dry for now. Which just leaves the linkage. Now we're not using the Tamiya ball ends, so we need to provide our own screws. Now we won't know exactly how this setup is going to end up just yet. We need the rest of the front axle in to work things out. Plus, well into the build, there's some parts that fit tightly around the servo arm which might affect things too. Now this is where having a bit of a collection of screws and other fixings can be quite helpful. When we've got a working system, I'll try and remember to list the screw sizes, but for now I'm just using, I think, something around an M3x12 at both ends. The servo end threads straight into the servo arm, and the bell crank uses one of the nuts from the kit. The other nut and the short linkage will get fitted in a few steps, so we can put them off to the side just for now. If we do a quick test of the setup, we can see it works fairly well, but there's far too much motion at the crank. We'll definitely need to drill and tap a new hole further in on the arm to get things moving right. It'll do for now though. We really need more of the truck built to work out all the clearances. The main thing is, so far the only slop in the system is in the gear train of the servo. The rod ends are doing their job perfectly. And well, that's the end of bag A. One frame, ready to start mounting everything to. Very nice. Right, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys.